A single second can feel like an infinity when it carries the weight of a life-changing choice and deep emotion. We capture those eternal moments and turn them into cinematic art for your viewing pleasure. Hit subscribe now and explore the infinite nature of the human story with us.
My name is Bernard Augustus Cole. I am 64 years old. For the better part of 2 decades, I told myself that raising a daughter right was the greatest thing I had ever accomplished. I was a retired United States Army Staff Sergeant who had served in 2 theaters of war, built a small watch repair business from nothing in Savannah, Georgia, and buried his wife with grace and dignity. I thought the hard part was done. I thought I had earned my quiet. I was wrong. My daughter's husband decided that an old man who repaired timepieces for a living was an easy mark. He thought my hands were slower than they used to be. He thought my mind was going soft around the edges. He thought that because I moved carefully and spoke slowly and never raised my voice, that I was somehow diminished. He made the same mistake that men of his kind always make. He confused gentleness with weakness. He looked at my gray hair and my reading glasses and my small shop on Bull Street, and he saw a door with a rusted lock. Something to be forced open. Something to be taken from. He never once considered that a man who spent 30 years in the United States Army might know a thing or two about patience, about ambush, about waiting for exactly the right moment to finish a fight. Before I tell you how my son-in-law's greed unraveled a secret that had been buried for 60 years, I want to know where in this country my story has reached. Leave me a comment and let me know where you are listening from. And if you believe that the quietest men sometimes carry the most carefully loaded guns, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. You will not regret staying. It began on a Sunday, the way most things do in a Southern family. I cooked. My daughter and her husband came over. And somewhere between the cornbread and the peach cobbler, I watched the man my daughter had married and understood with absolute certainty that something was very wrong. His name was Vincent. He was 37 years old, broad-shouldered and handsome, in the way that certain shallow men are handsome, all surface and no foundation. He had a real estate business that flipped houses, which is a polite way of saying he borrowed heavily against future optimism and then watched that optimism collapse. I had known about the money problems for almost a year. My daughter, Lydia, had come to me quietly 3 months before, her eyes carrying that particular exhaustion that belongs to women married to men who are too proud to ask for help and too reckless to stop needing it. She had asked if I could loan them $40,000. I did not hesitate. I told her yes, because she was my child, and I would have given her twice that without a second thought. That was my first mistake. Not the giving. The giving was right. The mistake was in not understanding what my yes told Vincent about me. To a man like him, generosity is not warmth. It is intelligence about available resources. The moment I wrote that check, I stopped being Lydia's father and became something else entirely. An asset waiting to be liquidated. He sat at my kitchen table that Sunday, and he was different. Not rude, not obvious. Men like Vincent are never obvious. But there was a new quality to his attention, something measuring and proprietary. The way a contractor walks through a house before he puts in an offer. His eyes moved over my bookshelves, over the framed photographs, over the old cherrywood cabinet in the hallway that I had inherited from my father. He asked me, very casually, whether I had ever considered downsizing, whether a big house was really practical for one man living alone. He smiled when he said it. He made it sound like concern. I put a forkful of cobbler in my mouth and looked at him for a long moment before I answered. I said that I had spent 22 years in the United States Army living in spaces barely bigger than a broom closet, and that I had earned every square foot of this house. He laughed. He said, of course, of course. He raised his glass of sweet tea like I had said something charming. But then my daughter, the way daughters do, opened a door she did not know was there. She mentioned, while clearing the plates, that Vincent's latest project had hit some complications. A property in Beaufort County. Permits taking longer than expected. The carrying costs adding up. She said it lightly. The way people say things they have been carrying heavily for months. Vincent's jaw tightened. He looked at her with an expression that was nearly a smile and told her that everything was under control. His voice had a low current running through it, like a river that looks calm from the bank. My daughter nodded quickly and said she was sure it was. She was not sure. I could see it in how her shoulders curved inward, just slightly, like a plant that has not had enough light. That small movement told me more than an hour of conversation could have. It told me that the man across my table had been leaning on her in ways she had not yet found words for. It told me that my $40,000 was gone and would never come back, and that she already knew it. It told me that there would be a second ask coming, and that this time it would not come from my daughter. It would come from him. After dinner, while Lydia washed dishes, Vincent found me on the back porch. He leaned against the railing and looked out at the yard, at the old live oaks draped in Spanish moss that my father had planted before I was born. He told me it was a beautiful property. He said it in the voice of a man appraising something he intends to own. He asked if I had ever had it formally valued. I said I had not. He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they are filing information away. He said that with the real estate market being what it was, a piece of land this size in Savannah, that close to the river, would be worth considerably more than most people realized. He said there were developers who would be very interested. He said he had contacts. He said he only mentioned it because he wanted to make sure I was aware of my options. He said the word options the way certain men say it, as if they are doing you a favor by helping you see how easily your life could be dismantled. I said thank you. I said I would think about it. I watched him go back inside, and I stood on that porch in the cooling evening air, and I listened to the frogs starting up in the drainage ditch at the back of the yard. My father built this house. My father planted those oaks, and some part of me, some old cold part that went dormant after my wife passed, woke up and paid attention. I did not say anything to Lydia when they left. I hugged her at the door and told her dinner was wonderful and that I would call her in the week. Vincent shook my hand. His grip was firm and deliberate, the grip of a man making a statement. I shook back with exactly the same pressure, and I watched him walk to his car, and I watched the car pull away. And then I went back inside and I sat in the dark for a long time. My wife, Caroline, God rest her, used to say that I had what she called a soldier's stillness, that when something was wrong, really wrong, I did not panic or pace or raise my voice. I went quiet. She meant it as a compliment, but she also meant it as a warning, because she knew what lived on the other side of that stillness. She knew that when I went truly quiet, it meant I was preparing. It meant I had assessed the terrain and identified the threat, and was now simply waiting for the optimal moment to act. I sat in the dark and I went very still, and I thought about the past 2 hours with the dispassion of a man reading a map. The questions about the property, the remarks about developers, the timing of all of it, 6 months after the loan, 3 months after the permits in Beaufort started failing. I thought about what a man like Vincent would need, practically, if he intended to do what I believed he intended to do. He would need access to my financial records. He would need to know what I had and where I kept it. He would need, eventually, to get inside this house without me expecting him. I was not angry. Anger is a fire that burns the man who holds it. I was something colder and more useful. I was decided. The next morning I drove to the offices of Harriet Okafor, the estate attorney who had handled Caroline's affairs, and who had managed my own legal matters for 11 years. Harriet was a small, precise woman with close-cropped silver hair, and the manner of someone who has heard every variety of human foolishness and is no longer surprised by any of it. She listened without interrupting while I laid out what I had observed and what I suspected. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and asked what exactly I wanted to accomplish. I told her. I did not want to simply protect my assets, though that was necessary. I wanted my daughter to understand without any possible ambiguity what the man she was married to was willing to do. I wanted the evidence to be so clear, so undeniable, that no argument or manipulation could survive it. I wanted Vincent to prove himself, and I wanted Lydia to be the one to watch him do it. Harriet set down her pen. She said that was a more complex objective than simply filing for asset protection. I told her I was aware of that. She said we would need to be careful, methodical, and that every step had to be legally airtight. I told her that was why I had come to her instead of handling it myself. We spent 2 hours in that office. By the time I walked out into the Savannah heat, the legal framework was in place. The deed to my property and all accompanying documentation had been quietly moved into a family trust established under my sole control. The original records on file at the county courthouse remained as they were, which is to say, they appeared to show a straightforward individual ownership that a man with enough initiative and a middling grasp of property law might believe was accessible under the right circumstances. We left him a door that looked like it could be opened. We just made sure that what was behind it was not what he was expecting. I drove home and I went into my workshop, the room at the back of the house where I kept my clocks and my tools and my father's things. I had converted it from a sunroom 30 years ago, and it smelled of machine oil and old paper and the particular woody sweetness of antique casings. I sat at my workbench for a long time, not working, just thinking. Then I made the phone call. I waited until I knew Lydia would be home and Vincent would be nearby. I had been told by enough people over enough years that I had a comforting voice, deep and steady, in a way that evidently suggested safety. I made my voice something else that afternoon. I added what I can only describe as edges, a slight roughness, a searching quality, as if I were reaching for words and occasionally not finding them quickly enough. It was a performance I had been constructing in my mind since the night before, and I had gotten it right. Lydia answered on the second ring. I told her I was sorry to bother her. She said immediately, the way she always has, that I was never a bother. Her voice was warm and I felt the weight of what I was doing, but I had a surgeon's sense of purpose. Sometimes the cut is an act of love. I told her that I had been thinking about getting my affairs in order. I mentioned a man from my church who had passed unexpectedly without a will and left his family in chaos. I let my voice carry a careful thread of anxiety. I told her that I had been looking for the folder where I kept the paperwork for my property, the deed, and the old insurance documents, and the survey maps. I said I could not seem to lay my hands on it. I said my memory had been giving me some trouble lately. Little things. Nothing serious. But it worried me. Lydia made the sound she makes when she is about to solve a problem. She said she could come by. She could help me look. I told her that would be wonderful. And then, at exactly the right moment, I added the piece I had prepared. I said I was fairly sure the folder was in the lockbox in my workshop, the green metal one my father gave me. I said I kept the key to that box taped to the inside back cover of the big Bible on the shelf above my workbench. I said I had put it there so I would not lose it. I said it the way a man says something he is slightly embarrassed about. A small confession of domestic disorganization. I heard movement in the background and I knew Vincent was in the room. Lydia said she would be by on Thursday afternoon. I said that was perfect. I said I appreciated her so much. I said I did not know what I would do without her. After I hung up the telephone, I sat at my workbench and I did not move for a few minutes. There was no pleasure in it. There was only necessity, and the particular cold clarity that follows a decision that cannot be undone. The following morning I addressed the workshop. I am a clockmaker, by trade and by disposition, which means I understand that the most precise mechanism is useless if its housing is not correct. I thought about where Vincent would go and when, and what he would need to see, and what he would need to find, and I built the stage accordingly. The lockbox I had described to Lydia was real. It was an old green metal strongbox my father had kept his important papers in. Scratched and dented. The kind of box that looks like it contains something significant. I had kept it on the shelf beneath the workbench for 40 years without anyone giving it particular attention. Now I opened it and removed everything of value. In its place I put two things, a folder of documents and a letter. The documents were copies, old copies of old papers. Specific papers that I will describe in a moment because their significance is the center of everything. The letter I wrote myself by hand, with the good pen I had used to sign every contract in my career. The words were few, and they were exact. I had rehearsed them in my mind through 2 nights of imperfect sleep, and by the time I set pen to paper, I did not need to think. I simply wrote. I sealed the letter inside the folder and closed the lockbox and put it back in its place beneath the workbench. Then I went about the business of the day as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The camera I installed that Wednesday took me less than an hour. I had purchased it online. A small wireless device no larger than a coat button, equipped with night vision and motion activation. I was an Army engineer before I was a watch repairman, and I have been taking things apart and putting them back together with precision since I was 19 years old. I placed it inside a decommissioned anniversary clock that sat on the high shelf above the workshop door, facing the workbench. I had kept that clock for 30 years. A gift from a commanding officer, and it had not run in a decade. Now, it had a different purpose. The lens was invisible from below. The feed ran to my phone, from my bedroom, from my kitchen, from anywhere within range of my home network. I could watch my workshop in real time and in high definition. I tested it Thursday morning, walking the path from the workshop door to the workbench the way a man might walk it if he thought no one was watching. The image was steady and clear. I could read the labels on the small jars of chemicals on the far shelf. I could see the keyhole on the lockbox. I could see the Bible on the shelf above the workbench, its old burgundy cover worn pale at the corners. I put my phone in my shirt pocket and went to the front of the house and waited for my daughter. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon, alone. We sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and talked about ordinary things for almost an hour. I watched her face and thought about the fact that she did not know what was coming and could not be told. And I made peace with that the way a soldier makes peace with collateral damage that cannot be avoided. At 3 o'clock, she helped me look through a stack of folders I had arranged on the kitchen table, documents that were real but not the ones in the lockbox, and I allowed us to reach the conclusion together that the important folder must be somewhere in the workshop. I said I thought I remembered putting it in the lockbox. I went through the performance of checking the Bible for the key with Lydia watching, and we found together what I had left for her to find. She helped me open the lockbox, at which point I told her everything in there looked fine, but I would go through it properly later. I was buying time, not closing the loop. I needed her to know where the key was. I needed her to have told Vincent. She hugged me at the door when she left, and I stood on the porch and watched her car turn onto the street. I went inside. I checked the camera feed. I waited. He came 4 nights later. I had been monitoring the feed every night, lying in bed with my phone screen dimmed, watching the stillness of the workshop until I fell asleep and woke and checked again. On the 4th night, at 20 minutes past midnight, the motion sensor triggered. The feed sharpened into focus, the night vision rendering everything in shades of gray and pale green. The workshop door opened. He did not turn on the overhead light. He used his phone, held low, its beam cutting a narrow path across the floor. He moved with more confidence than I expected, not hurrying, which told me he had thought about this more than once. He had rehearsed it in his mind the way I had rehearsed my own steps. He knew the layout of the room because Lydia had described it to him, and because men like Vincent always do their homework when the reward is large enough. He went directly to the workbench. I watched him on the small screen, and I felt nothing that I had not already felt. The anger was used up. What remained was a kind of watchful sorrow, the feeling of watching an inevitable thing complete itself. He found the Bible. His hand moved to the back cover. I watched him peel the key from the tape I had placed it on, and in that moment, watching the ease of it, I understood something I had known theoretically but now felt as a fact. He had been planning this for a long time. This was not an impulse. This was the culmination of a strategy that had been developing since, perhaps, before the loan. Since, perhaps, before the marriage. He opened the lockbox. He rifled through the folder quickly at first, the way people do when they expect to find something obvious, cash or certificates, or something with a dollar amount printed on it. Then he slowed. He pulled out the first document and angled his phone at it and read. I watched his posture change. The searching quality left his movements. He went still in the way that people go still when they are reading something that requires all of their attention. He read the second document. He read it twice. I could tell by the way his head moved. Then he found the letter. He opened it and read it, and I watched his face on the screen, and I saw the moment the contents registered. His chin dropped slightly. He stood like that for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he put everything back in the folder, closed the lockbox, replaced the key in the Bible, exactly as he had found it, and walked out of my workshop. I lay in the dark, and I called Harriet Okafor and left a message. Then I called my daughter. The drive to their house took 20 minutes. I had texted Lydia before I left, and she had called me back immediately. Frightened by the hour and the formality of my message, I told her to wait for me. I told her it was important. I told her to make sure Vincent was home. When I arrived, Lydia opened the door in a robe, her face tight with worry. Vincent was in the kitchen in a t-shirt and sweatpants, a glass of water on the counter in front of him. He looked at me when I came through the door, and I saw in his eyes something I had expected, but which still landed with force. It was not guilt. Guilt implies surprise. What I saw in his eyes was the flat, careful look of a man who has been caught and is already calculating his next move. I sat down at their kitchen table. I asked Lydia to sit beside me. Vincent remained standing by the counter. I said I had something to show them, and I placed my phone on the table and turned the screen toward them and let the video play. Lydia made a sound I will not try to describe. She watched her husband move through the workshop she had helped me search, and she watched his hands, the same hands she held, find the Bible and find the key, and open the box that she had opened with me just days before. She watched him read. She watched him replace everything exactly as he had found it, the practiced care of a man erasing himself, and she watched him walk out. The video ran 43 seconds. The kitchen was very quiet when it finished. Vincent opened his mouth. I held up one hand and he closed it again. I looked at my daughter first, because she was the reason I was in this room, and I said that what she had just seen was not the beginning. It was an endpoint, and that what came before it was something she deserved to know, because it was her history as much as mine. Then I told them about the documents. My father was born in 1,928 inches, Liberty County, Georgia, to a family that had been farming that coastal land for 3 generations. His own father, my grandfather, had worked the same acres that his father had worked. Good bottomland close to the Medway River. The kind of land that had been in black families since Reconstruction, held by people who understood that land was the only wealth that could not be taken by a bank or burned in a night. My grandfather was a serious man who kept careful records. He paid his taxes every year without fail. He documented everything. In 1951, a development company from out of state approached landowners along a 12-mile corridor north of the river. They wanted to build a resort and a marina. Most of the black landowners in the area were offered a fraction of what white landowners received for comparable parcels. Several were not approached at all. My grandfather was told his property had insufficient road access and that the company was not interested. My grandfather did not dispute this. He thanked the man who told him and went home. But he also, that same week, drove to the county courthouse and sat in a room for an entire afternoon and reviewed every public record he could find regarding the development project and the properties it had acquired. And he discovered that the road access issue was invented, that his land had been deliberately excluded from the acquisition to be reapproached later, at a lower price, after the surrounding area had been purchased and his remaining negotiating leverage had been removed. He documented what he found. He made copies. He put everything in a green metal strongbox and he kept it. Because he was a man who understood that the truth is worthless if you cannot prove it. The resort was never built. The development company dissolved in 1958. The land corridor sat largely undeveloped for decades, changing hands several times, its value fluctuating with the local economy. My father inherited my grandfather's parcel in 1971, and I inherited it from my father in 2003. When I retired from the Army, I had it surveyed and appraised, and I discovered that the 12 miles my grandfather had mapped in that courthouse 50 years earlier were now among the most sought-after coastal development land in the Myrtle, state of Georgia. 3 of the parcels in that corridor had sold in the past decade at prices that would have struck my grandfather as science fiction. My land sat at the northern end of that corridor. I had received 2 serious offers in the past 4 years. I had declined both of them because I was not ready to sell and because the land belonged to my family and I was not going to part with it for anything less than what it deserved. Vincent had learned about those offers. I do not know exactly how, whether through Lydia or through his own research, but he had learned and he had understood, and that understanding was what had transformed me, in his mind, from a father-in-law into an obstacle. The documents in the lockbox were copies of my grandfather's original records. The survey maps, the correspondence, the courthouse, notes. The proof that my family's claim to that land was 4 generations deep and legally unassailable. I had left them there because I wanted Vincent to understand, when he opened that box, exactly what he was up against. I wanted him to understand not just that he had failed, but why he had been going to fail from the very beginning. That the land he had been quietly planning to leverage, to pressure, to maneuver away from an old man he considered past his prime. That land was not simply mine. It was earned and documented and defended across 70 years, and 3 generations of people who refused to accept the version of the story that was most convenient for someone else. The letter I had written was short. It said, "You came looking for something that was never yours. Everything in this box is evidence of what my family built and protected before you were born. The same ground your grandfather's kind tried to take with a lie, and failed. You came here with the same plan, and you will leave with the same result. Nothing. Now you know who you married into. Act accordingly." Vincent had gone very still against the kitchen counter. He did not look at the table. He looked at a point slightly above my head. The way men look when they are deciding whether to deny something that cannot be denied. My daughter was not looking at him. She was looking at her hands, flat on the table in front of her, and I watched her face move through things that I knew would take her months to fully process. Betrayal has layers. You do not feel all of them at once. You feel the first one, sharp and total, and then over time the deeper ones rise to the surface like stones in thawing ground. She asked him, very quietly, if what she had watched on that phone was real. He said it was a misunderstanding. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a man holding something heavy and feeling his grip start to go. She asked him what he had been looking for. He did not answer. She asked him whether the loan he had requested from her father, the $40,000, had ever been intended to be repaid. The silence that followed was its own answer. Lydia sat at that table for a long moment, very still, the way I go still when I am deciding something. She got that from me. I watched her do it, and my heart was full of sorrow and love in equal measure. Then she stood up, and she walked out of the kitchen, and I heard her footsteps on the stairs going up. I looked at Vincent. He looked back at me. And now there was something different in his expression. The calculation was gone. What was left was smaller, younger, and frightened. He looked like what he was, a man who had made a large and irreversible mistake and knew it. I told him that I was not going to destroy him. I told him that my daughter would make her own decisions about her marriage, and that those decisions were none of my business, that I would support her whatever she chose. I told him that the loan was forgiven, not because I was a generous man, but because the alternative was tying my daughter to a debt she had nothing to do with creating. I told him that if he ever again came within reach of anything that belonged to my family, to my property or my accounts or my history, I would become a very different kind of problem than the one he had encountered tonight. I told him that quietly and without emphasis, because emphasis was not necessary. Then I told him something else. I told him that the worst thing that had happened to him tonight was not getting caught. Getting caught was just a fact. Facts can be survived. The worst thing that had happened to him was that he now understood what he was. He had walked into that workshop as a man with a plan, and he had walked out as a man who understood his own floor, who he was when no one was watching, what he was willing to do to people who had given him nothing but trust and money and the warmth of a family. He had to carry that knowledge now. And the particular weight of that kind of self-knowledge, I told him, does not get lighter with time. I stood up and I pushed in my chair and I left. On the drive home, the city was dark, and the Spanish moss moved faintly in the salt air off the river, and I thought about my father and my grandfather and the green metal box that had passed from hand to hand through 80 years of this family's life. I thought about my wife Caroline, who had known from the day she met Vincent that something about his laugh was 2 degrees off from genuine, who had told me so quietly one evening, and then never said it again, because she was not a woman who repeated herself. I thought about my daughter asleep in a house that was about to change around her. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and old and very sure that what I had done was right, which is a different and more durable feeling. In the months that followed, Lydia made her own decision. She made it slowly and carefully, the way she has always done everything, with research and thought and several long conversations on my back porch that sometimes stretched past midnight. She did not ask me what to think. She already knew what she thought. She just needed room to say it out loud until it became the shape of something she could act on. She is all right. That is the thing I want you to understand most. Whatever else you take from this story, she is all right. She came by on a Saturday in November with a bottle of good bourbon, and we sat at the kitchen table and she asked me to tell her everything about my grandfather, the courthouse, the land, all of it. She had never heard the full story. I had kept it from her without thinking, the way parents keep hard things from children long after those children are grown, out of a habit of protection that outlives its usefulness. I told her everything. She listened the way she used to listen when she was small, and I read to her, completely and without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said that she wanted to see the land. We drove out the following Sunday in the early morning before the heat built. I parked on the gravel shoulder and we walked the boundary the way my father had walked it with me and his father had walked it with him. The marsh grass moved in a slow tide, and the herons stood in the shallows like gray sentinels, and the light came off the water in long, flat plates of gold. My daughter put her hand in mine the way she used to when she was 4 years old, and we stood there at the edge of what our family had protected, and I felt the full weight and worth of it. She said she thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I said her great-great-grandmother had said the same thing. I know because my grandfather wrote it down. The lesson I carry from all of this is not about money or property or legal strategy, though all of those things matter and all of those things saved me. The lesson is about documentation, about the quiet, persistent, unglamorous act of writing things down and keeping records and refusing to let the truth become whatever the more powerful party says it is. My grandfather could have accepted the developer's story. It would have been easier. It would have spared him an afternoon in a courthouse and years of being the kind of man who keeps careful copies of everything in a battered green box. But he did not accept it. He looked for the evidence. He preserved it. He passed it on. And 70 years later, that green box stopped a thief who never knew it existed. The world has always contained men who look at what other people have built and feel entitled to it. The answer to those men is not rage. It is records. It is patience. It is the willingness to build something solid enough that when someone comes to take it, what they find instead is a foundation they cannot move. That foundation is what I am leaving to my daughter. Not the land alone, though the land is real and it is hers. The foundation, I mean, is knowledge. The complete and documented and irreducible truth of where she comes from. That is the inheritance that cannot be stolen or lost or leveraged away by a man with a borrowed plan and a phone flashlight in a darkened workshop. If this story reached you, wherever you are in this country, I hope you felt something in it that belonged to you. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you are. And if you believe that quiet men sometimes win the longest fights, subscribe to this channel. There is more to tell.